Thank you. So I've got 20 minutes, I believe, so I'm going to move through this as quickly as I reasonably can. I'm going to talk about designing for context, which is something we're thinking about a lot more these days. Thank you for what you said about Fjord. We're about 225 people. We were acquired by Accenture exactly 11 months ago to the day, I think. And our job really is to act as the interface between technology and people, and to bring, our mission, if you like, is to bring design to the forefront. We think that design should be at the heart of businesses. We think design should be at the heart of society. And not that it can solve everything, of course it can't, but it can go a long way in the digital age to solving a lot of the challenges that we see at a societal and at a brand level as well. On that note, we think that we're entering now what we would call the third era of digital. The first era really began, what, 93, 94? I set up a company called CHBI in 93 with a colleague, which we sold to Razorfish in 98. We started doing digital work then. And that was really all, web-based, largely. Then mobile came along. We saw a key step change in that when iOS and the smartphone and Apple iPhone arrived. That was just, what, 6, 7 years ago now? Make no mistake, we're still in the middle. In fact, we're probably still in relatively early days of mobile. I think most of us are still struggling to understand what it means. Most organizations are. It's still bringing sweeping changes to our lives, and that isn't going to stop now just because we're putting up this chart. What we are seeing, though, I think unexpectedly accelerating, is the launch or the beginning of an era we call living services. We have a pet hatred, which is the term Internet of Things. It's slightly too hardware-focused, and it doesn't really describe at any reasonable level what the next era is about. So we believe that it's better to call the next era living services, because what we see with coming is many, many, many things connected together. As we all know, we've talked about this, Will's talked about this already, displaying data, creating data, and sharing data across the internet. And the result of that is going to be things which are much more proximate to our lives, to our real lives, things that matter to us in a way which many of the things we've seen on digital so far haven't yet got as close to us as they could do. It's very cool to get a book off Amazon in 24 hours. But the things that are going to happen with living services are actually going to be very proximate to things that really matter to us. Our daily lives, our houses, our children, our parents, our health, our education, etc. The second reason we call them living services is because they will change and adapt in real time. Conceptually, it's very hard to get our heads around what this is going to mean, but in 15 years' time, design will be living design, and it will be completely different from what we're doing at the moment, because it will be about creating the affordances for consumers to create the experiences around themselves on the fly in real time. In the future, the user will be the operating system, and we'll stop worrying about operating systems like iOS and Android, because stuff will be coming together around the consumer. This is at the core of what we see happening very soon now with living services. And that's important, because all these things, we just heard about the light bulbs. I didn't know about the Philips light bulbs. Nice touch. We hear about these things all the time. There's more and more happening, and all of them are creating more and more opportunities to detect context. And designers always use context, if we think about it. So, great architectural design has used context of where the buildings are set. Bad design, bad context. Check The Guardian today. There's a great article on the top 10 most horrible skyscrapers in London. Very good example of bad context, especially the one in Elephant and Castle. We've used design in marketing to sell brand stories. We've used design as humans at events to challenge or surprise people. We've used context when it comes, if you think, to the way in which jokes work. Jokes entirely work off situational breaking of context. That's what these two are doing here. And we've used context to create utilities that work. The new design, the new signs that have got up in London in the last 5 years are a fantastic example of contextual design actually making something in street furniture relevant and useful to people, so they don't have to figure out which way is north, which way is south. When we think about digital context, then there are really two elements we need to think about. We need to think about the technical element and the human element. And our view is that too often we focus on the technical element and not enough on the human element. So the technical element are things that we know about because we can see them with sensors. Increasingly, our cars can detect what we are doing. They can detect the things that are around us on the road. They can begin, and this is happening as we know, to network with other cars to understand what they are doing too. There will be a great deal of change that comes out of that whole autonomous car movement. But then there's human behavior. So we can study this using all sorts of research techniques. We can take guesses from what the data is telling us, but a lot of it is not detectable. You know, my father died 3 years ago pretty much to the day. I think about it a lot at the moment. None of you would have known that unless I had told you about it. It may be changing the context of the way in which my brain is thinking. On an up note, I saw a green woodpecker on the lawn this morning when I got up. Made me feel very happy. That's certainly lifting me during the day. You wouldn't have known that. There is no contextual data that I am aware of through my smartphone or my Nest thermostat or my computer that would have been able to detect any of those things. I challenge you to come up with a system that could easily detect those things in the near future. Maybe in 50 years, but not in the next 2 or 3 years, not during our lifetime of work anyway, I don't think. So what this means is that although we'll know a lot about location, we'll know a lot about the weather, as we've just been hearing, we'll know a lot about what I might be doing in my calendar, which of course can change and may have context behind it which is less detectable, because a calendar really is just a series of structured words. What is much harder to understand are what are the group dynamics going on amongst a group of people? What is my mood? What are the things that might be affecting my head at any given moment? Why am I going shopping and trying to buy something? What is my mission? One of the things that retailers try to do, and is very difficult to do, and so far humans are still the best at detecting, is what your mission is in a shop. If you go into a butcher's and buy a joint of beef, what's your mission? You're not buying the joint of beef. Your mission generally could be Sunday lunch, could be romantic meal for two, could be comfort food because you're miserable, could be a whole number of things. A really clever butcher will ask you and will detect it and then figure out other things he can sell to you at the same time. That mood stuff is much harder for technology to understand. And this is a problem because as we move into the digital era, as we have moved into the digital era, then we expect a great deal more from digital experiences. We're seeing a great deal begin to happen. So our expectations are very high now for what we can see delivered to us through our tablets or our phones, because we've begun to see organizations like Google make clever guesses and deliver things which are contextually relevant. And this is a challenge. So expectations are high, but actually it's very difficult for us to deliver to this. So there is a myth. And the myth is that if using the entire system that surrounds a consumer or a customer or a user, we can get enough data, then we can understand them and create a better experience. So this may be slightly contrarian given the nature of today being about context, but our view is that this myth is actually at the heart of some deep design dangers that we need to be very aware of. And this is a myth if you like graphics. And I'm going to come back to this as a reason why I'm showing this. Because what happens is we ignore human traits, what my colleague and co-founder of the company, Olof, calls pure human weirdness, the things that's going on in the background. And it's going to be some time before we can detect this. So when you get digital solutions, clearly you get benefits, and there's no doubt that digital mapping through smartphones has been transformative. But some of you may remember this. This was in 2011 when the rumor went around that iOS was actually storing, without asking your permission, all your location data. And there was a shitstorm about it. It caused them a real problem for a while until it became clear that actually they were storing it on your phone, and the data, I believe I'm right in saying, was never transmitted back to Apple. But for a while, it freaked consumers out. The idea that here was a company which was giving them a benefit, but there was a hidden cost that they were unaware of, and a price that they were unaware they were going to have to pay at some stage. We've seen this, I think, writ large in a political and a societal way in the UK this year, with the NHS's decision to postpone the automatic gathering of our data in order to improve health outcomes across the country. Again, a shitstorm was stirred up here, in my view, largely by the tabloid newspapers acting from ignorance. That's a personal view. because they didn't actually really understand what the benefits were. They took a calculated guess that their readers wouldn't understand the benefits. They weren't particularly prepared to explain them to them. So everybody got very frightened at the idea that the NHS would be storing and aggregating our data, even though the people in charge of it were very clear this stuff is going to be anonymized. It isn't going to be clear who's got diabetes or whatever it may be across the country. What happened politically was it became an unsustainable proposition. And it became unsustainable, even though the benefits were great, because people saw the nebulous costs as much higher than the benefits they got. To some extent, this is the same thing that's happened with Edward Snowden. You know, the whole debate is around cost and benefit. I'm not, by the way, in favor of what the NSA have been doing, but what I am trying to point out is the NSA, I think, would argue that the benefit to society as a whole, certainly American society, is greater than the cost that's imposed on seeing everyone's behavior. But people are wary of this, and this is a very real barrier to success for organizations. And what we need to be doing is looking for, and it's really a very, very simple formula, there's nothing rocket science about this, is look at what it is you're doing with the customer and genuinely plot this out. What's the benefit here, and what might the cost be? And by cost, I think what you have to be looking for is what are the perceived emotional costs, because those perceived emotional costs, rather than some marginal pound cost, because I think that's unlikely to be high for a consumer, those perceived emotional costs can be the big barriers to success here. So it's crucial when you're looking at this to understand these. And there are people, even now, who are still getting it wrong. And I suggest to you that in a year's time, we will all be able to come back here and create a list 3 pages long compared to this of people who are getting it wrong. So Runkeeper, which is one of my favorite applications, I've been using it avidly for years now, Runkeeper do something which really pisses me off. I go for a run on when I'm working from home. I try and work from home a day a week if I can. I'll typically go for a run in the middle of the day because that suits me well. A week later, I'll be sitting in some hotel basement in a meeting with 25 people in a workshop which is lasting all day in Istanbul. I'll be tired and bored, and my phone will buzz, and I'll look at it, and Runkeeper will say, I quote, "This time a week ago, you thought it was a really good idea to take some exercise. Why not do it now?" And I'm looking at my phone, I'm thinking, I can't do this now. So there's an example of a company who, if they had access to my calendar, and it wouldn't be difficult for me to give them that, and had access to my location, and it wouldn't be difficult for me to give them that, it would be very easy for them to work out this is not a good time to irritate Mark by suggesting that he takes exercise, because clearly he's not in an exercise mode today. Another example is Gmail. So we're all familiar with Gmail doing their tracking, but they get it horribly wrong. So personally, it's a very personal thing. I loathe golf. I don't think it's an interesting or clever sport. And I wrote this in an email to a friend about a year ago. I got golf adverts non-stop on Gmail for the next week. They completely misunderstood the context of what I was saying. In fact, at the same time, I was planning to go on a big cycle ride, and I was writing about the cycle ride, and I started getting dietary advice. I don't think I need to diet. It certainly wasn't on my plan. My plan, in fact, for the cycle ride was to bulk up as much as I could, not to diet. So again, Google, very clever company, their algorithms didn't really understand the context I was in. And those are 2 personal examples. We see examples of companies not using context in a way that they could. So for example, if you use AccuWeather on Android, certainly in the US, they give you multiple locations. You can set up multiple locations, but the app persistently defaults to the first location you set up, which is really, really dull if you're traveling a lot. And it forgets the last one that you used as well, which is another sort of contextual design no-no. And then there's Spotify. So I love Spotify. I'm sure many people in the room do, and I will barely hear a word said against them. But I do wish that it would remember what I was listening to on my phone when I get home, or plug in my car so that I can listen to it then. It seems to me that that would be relatively easy to do, but they haven't done it, and therefore they are, ignoring a sense of context of what I have been doing and my habits and behavior. Now, there are some companies getting it right, and I'm not going to go into these because I think most of them will be familiar to you. Uber, I think, is an example of a company that got it absolutely dead right, which is why it's being so successful. Square are getting it right with payments, and PayPal as well. You walk into a shop, they know they're there. Your photo will increasingly come up on the cash till. The people will know your name. They'll be able to recognize you. As long as the permission is there, then I think that's another very good example of great contextual work. Google Now, still very much work in progress, but I think a leading example, for all my criticism of Gmail, a leading example of a company getting it right. Nest is a good example of understanding people's context in terms of the way they're moving around the home. And lastly, check out Aviate. Aviate is an app only available on Android. It's quite important, that bit, because Apple, I think, would never allow this to happen to their home screen. Aviate is an app on Android which contextually senses where you are and rearranges the apps on your home screen to bring you the ones that it thinks will be most relevant to you. So you get into work, and it's the work-style apps that are there. You get home, it's leisure apps. And actually, I just read this morning, because I was reading about it again this morning. You plug in your headphones, it brings you music apps to the surface, which is a really clever idea. But beware, again, I don't know about you, but when I plug in my headphones, I have two reasons for doing it. One is I might want to listen to music, probably about 70% of the time, but 30% of the time it's because I want to make a phone call. So if what happens then is that the music apps get in the way of me making a phone call, then the primary purpose of what I want to do has been obliterated, and the contextual guess was wrong. So I'm calling that out because the problem with increasing contextual awareness is actually it can be very damaging to the user experience, and this is really the key point I want to leave you with. So the reality of the chart that I showed earlier, which was the myth of as you get more contextual awareness, so user experience improves, the reality, we think, is actually a lot more like this. And we've seen this before, and some people in the room will have seen this before. This is the uncanny valley theory. So the uncanny valley theory was developed for robotics. And it works as follows. As the more and more a robot looks like and feels like a human being, and it is more and more, the more and more it feels familiar to us. But this goes through a dip, and the dip looks like this. So this robot is cute. It looks a little like a human being. You can see what they've done. They've done the big eyes, etc., etc. This robot is not so cute. They've not quite got the full-on Blade Runner experience going here. And as a result, you have this uncanny valley effect where actually everything dips away and the robot suddenly becomes something really, I suggest you'd probably be happy with one of these in your home. I definitely would not be happy with one of these in my home at all, nor in the garden nor anywhere, actually. A failed context-aware system, i.e. one which leads into the abyss, and you can see the points I'm making, that contextually it's the same as a robotic theory. You can either do something quite well, or you can do it very well, but doing it halfway very well is actually going to be a really big problem. And there are two sweet spots here. So our recommendation is, this is a human challenge, and there are three things you need to do. The first is you can reduce the cost to the user to improve the experience. So the more you can automate stuff, the more you can give the user autonomy, the more secure you can make things. That's one perfectly reasonable strategy for using context. The second is to improve the benefit to the user in order to improve the experience. And the third is, if you can't reach sweet spot 2, then you should aim for sweet spot 1. Because the very high risk, and I've demonstrated it with Runkeeper, demonstrated it with what I'm saying about Aviate and plugging in the headphones at the wrong time, is that if you get your clever guess wrong, you're going to fall into the uncanny valley. And actually, that's worse than detrimental to the user experience. It could be a complete showstopper. So strategically, then there are two directions you can go. If you want to make sure you're not in the uncanny valley, either focus on reducing cost, in which case you're probably at sweet spot 1, or if you're clever enough and you've got the technology to do it, and you're dead sure about it, and you've probably tested it to destruction, then you can go for sweet spot 2, and you do that by increasing the benefit to the customer. That's why the rather simple formula I said earlier is actually deeply important. It gives us a very rooted and grounded way to understand what to do. So context is everywhere. With living services, we're seeing it explode. Detecting context is not as simple as it sounds because we're all individuals. If you do something where cost is greater than benefit, the user experience sinks through the floor, and that's a very dangerous place to be. And all of this, and of course we would say this because we're a design company, so yes, it may be self-serving, but I passionately believe it's true. This is not just a technology challenge. This is actually a design challenge, and therefore one for, in my view, everyone in this room. That's it.